Good day, Bapos. How was your first week? Indulging yourselves with the political thoughts of Maximo M. Calao? Indeed, we are now enduring the complexity of politics in the Philippines through the works of our very own political thinkers. But this is also a great experience, di ba? Because we political science students are really becoming conscious and attentive to the reality of the world and also to politics. Much more then will come, and new knowledge and understanding of politics will give us the opportunity to assess ourselves and to do the right thing. With this, you are now ready to learn the political thoughts of Onofre Corpuz on bureaucracy and civil service. So come on, join me, and let us have fun knowing the political thoughts of Onofre Corpus. So what do you know about government and bureaucracy? Actually, in many ways, bureaucracy and government have become identical. And that when we talk of government is to essentially refer to its bureaucratic mechanisms and power. And thus, attempting to comprehend the politics of the bureaucracy is very crucial to understanding how government works or does not work. And so, a government then cannot function without a bureaucracy. You must have to bear that in mind, that a government cannot function without a bureaucracy, according to Onofre Corpus. And why is that so? We must have to look into the concept of bureaucracy. So, for a country like the Philippines, the bureaucracy plays a vital role not only in ensuring the conduct of government, but also in building and shaping the nation. It means to say that bureaucracy really plays a significant role not only in the government level of giving services to the people, but also bureaucracy is important in its involvement in building and shaping the nation. And this notion of the link between nation and bureaucracy can be seen in the works of Onofre Corpus, particularly in his book entitled Bureaucracy in the Philippines, published in 1987. Yan. Now, those who see the government as the solution to what often seems to be an ever-growing list of apparent problems created by people in their various private undertakings are also often fail to identify that the government programs are also implemented by themselves, the people, okay, who have their own concerns, their own interests, and their own views of what is right and what is wrong. So this means to say that the bureaucratic government and its functionaries cannot do all the tasks alone. They need the support and the cooperation of the people or the civil society. So this is a link between the bureaucracy or the government and the civil society in achieving what we call nation, wherein all can live in harmony and peace. Now, let us familiarize ourselves about Onofre Corpus. As you can see, he was born in 1926 and died in 2013. He received the award National Scientist of the Philippines. And he was initially educated in his hometown of Camiling. And then Corpus received his college education from the University of the Philippines shortly after World War II. okay, graduating as magna cum laude. And then, he left the country for further studies, where he eventually obtained 3 graduate degrees. A master's degree, okay, at the University of Illinois, a master's degree also of public administration, okay, and a PhD in political economy and government in 1956 from Harvard University. And then he returned to the Philippines in 1957, and he had no equal. His closest contemporary, Remigio Agpalo, would only return to the country in 1958 after having obtained his PhD in political science from Indiana University. We will also talk about Remigio Agpalo later on. Okay? Pero mas nauna talaga kasi itong si Onofre Corpuz during his prime. Okay? And after Agpalo graduated and received his PhD, Onofre Corpuz and his doctoral dissertation entitled Bureaucracy in the Philippines had already been published by the Institute of Public Administration, okay, of UP. By the way, Institute of Public Administration was the precursor of the NCPAG, okay, or the National College of Public Administration and Governance at the University of the Philippines. Corpuz died in 2013 at the age of 87. Tanda rin siya, no? Yan. From the 1960s onward, Corpuz embarked on a career of public service, both within the university and in the national government. And this adventure of Corpuz in public service, both in the university and in the national government, would see him testing the ideas and arguments he makes in bureaucracy in the Philippines. In UP, he served as head of the Department of Political Science from 1961 to 1963. And during the pre-martial law years, he served as Secretary of Education from 1968 to 1971. That position, okay, will be again occupied by him from 1979 to 1983. And by the middle of the 1970s, Corpuz served the university again as the 13th president from 1975 to 1979. During the martial law years, he also served and helped shape the infamous martial law regime. In fact, in an article that came out in the Philippine Political Science Journal, Corpuz established the philosophical justification for martial law in the country. Meaning, Corpuz was an advocate of the declaration and execution of martial law. And why is that? We will see in his writings later on why he favored and supported martial law. In his book, The Bureaucracy in the Philippines, Corpuz offers a groundbreaking perspective of politics. Okay? And let us see that groundbreaking perspective on politics. Corpus' mentor at Harvard University, in the name of John Goss, advocated an ecological approach to understanding and managing the bureaucracy. Corpus has taken Goss' recommendation a step further by incorporating a historical dimension to the approach. And in his study of the bureaucracy, Corpus attempted to systematize the massive amount of historical data spanning from the length of Philippine colonial rule until the 1950s. And Corpus points out that his book, the bureaucracy in the Philippines is a study of the past and roots. A study of the past roots and present foundation of bureaucracy in the Philippines. In arguing for such a historical approach, Corpuz underpins the sense that the bureaucracy does not operate in a vacuum. Meaning, bureaucracy works never in an isolation of significant social, historical, and economic sources. So the bureaucracy will always work significantly, okay, in the social, historical, and economic concepts, according to Onofre Corpuz. And we will learn about that later on. How bureaucracy works really when we talk about the social, historical, and economic sources of the society. Aside from that, we will also look back to the time of the Spanish colonial rule and relating it to the Philippine bureaucracy that we have today. So, who are the bureaucrats? According to Onofre Corpuz, bureaucracy may be viewed as an organization or apparatus, and on the other hand, bureaucracy may also be viewed as collection of individual bureaucrats. Now, bureaucracy as an organization or apparatus, in this view, stress is on placed upon its corporate character or upon the organization itself. But on the other hand, okay, bureaucracy as collection of individual bureaucrats, the emphasis is placed upon the human individuals who constitute that apparatus or that organization. Now, according to Corpus, to have a methodological value, both views must necessarily include a consideration of the social context of bureaucracy. So what do we mean by social context of bureaucracy? Bureaucracy is not just an organization, but also a collection of individual people who are part of the society. So in the social context of bureaucracy, the bureaucracy is an organization that composes human individuals. Okay? It means also that the bureaucracy is created for the people. It is somewhat identical when we say the government is for the people, of the people, and by the people. Yan. Max Weber also argued that bureaucracy is said to be the most rational form of management, and it remains relevant until today because this management style is thought to be suitable for large-scale organizations in which timeliness, conformity, and orderliness are crucial to get the whole system run smoothly to provide services to the people. In the first view, bureaucracy then, as an organization, is a system and a politically overtowering force in the society. And why do we say that? Because it is the repository of most, if not all, okay, the repository of most of the technical expertise of the society. And if it is a repository of most of the technical expertise of the society, bureaucracy then compose technical experts. And these technical experts are the persons who provide specific knowledge or expertise relating to the organization. Not only to the organization, but also to the processes and activities of the organization or the bureaucracy itself. Aside from being a system and a political organization, the bureaucracy turns out to be a collection of many kinds of plain people. And these people are called bureaucrats. But they are not only bureaucrats, but they are also many other things. Because before and after office hours, they are also members of families. They are also members of the neighborhood, of clubs, of churches, of professions. Meaning to say, they are all, in addition to being bureaucrat, they are all private citizen taxpayers. But being bureaucrats, their allegiance to bureaucracy must always compete with their allegiances and interests in each of these other associations. Moreover, it will be seen from this new viewpoint that while a bureaucrat might be an expert for some administrative tasks, he is not necessarily an expert in all social skills. As a matter of fact, he is often an inept amateur in any line of activity which is unrelated to his bureaucratic duties. Okay? The works of Onofre Corpuz, he argued that the role of bureaucrats in the political process is of threefold. First, in their private capacity, that is as taxpayers, they might oppose tax-supported expansion of the bureaucracy. And that is true, diba? Even if you are a part or a member of the bureaucracy, you are still going to oppose in your private capacity whenever there are tax-supported expansion of the government or the bureaucracy. Okay? Second is in their capacity as bureaucrats. In their capacity as bureaucrats, if it is their agency that would benefit from the expansion, they might work within the confines of civil service laws to support the new program. Meaning to say that a bureaucrat will not go beyond giving extra effort to his work if it will not benefit him from the expansion advocated by the government or by the bureaucracy. Parang ang sinasabi dito, di naman ako nagbe-benefit sa programa na ina-advocate ng bureaucracy. Why would I go further in giving services to the people? Because in the first place, they are not getting a benefit from the expansion being made by the bureaucracy. So they will work or they might work within the confinements of civil service laws only and will not give extra effort in doing their job, okay, in giving services to the people. And finally, also in their capacity as bureaucrats, but in an entirely passive manner. If that is the case, the bureaucrats might do the bidding of friendly clienteles or interest groups. So dito natin makikita yung mga konsepto ng nepotism, compadre system, red tape, and other activities that are not really look into the ideal concept of the bureaucracy. Because as bureaucrats, in their entirely passive manner, there is a tendency for a bureaucrat to do his work and bid to friendly clienteles or interest groups that might give them also benefit. Okay, parang palitan lang. Kumbaga, I am the bureaucrat, you are the clientele, I benefit from you, you benefit from me, unahin kita in giving service. Ha? So parang nakikita natin dito yung negativity of the bureaucrats when they work in their capacity as bureaucrat but in an entirely passive manner. I hope in our bureaucrat today, this is not the case because I believe there are still many bureaucrats that are doing their job well and they go beyond giving extra effort to give services to the people. So, are you now ready to go back in time and look into the kind of bureaucracy that the Spaniards established in the Philippines during those times? Because in this discussion, we will also look into the characteristic of the Spanish bureaucrats, okay, that had been in the Philippines during the time of Spanish colonization. And for your information, in the earliest years of the Spanish regime in America, an adventurer or explorer, by contracting with the king to colonize or settle a new territory, was awarded the government of that colony for his lifetime. So parang ang sinasabi dito that an adventurer or explorer, by making a contract with the king, okay, to colonize or settle into a new territory, the king will award him the lifetime government of that territory. Okay? And in the Philippines, it was Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, as you can see in my PowerPoint presentation, was the first to receive this favor in Filipinas, serving in the office of the Governor General until his death in 1572. Okay? So this kind of contract between an adventurer and the King of Spain is called as proprietary bureaucracy. Okay? It is called proprietary bureaucracy. And since the explorer was given the government of a colony for a lifetime, that explorer or that proprietary bureaucrat then must have led an easy life. Sometimes he enjoyed a salary, but in general, he was vested with the power to collect the tributes and taxes of his district or colony. And he also remitted to the royal coffers what was due to the king, but retained a usually large surplus for himself. Grabe, di ba? And this income was further augmented by collecting also other fees for official acts performed for private individuals. So makikita natin dito kung paano yung sistema ng pagbibigay ng serbisyo ng Spanish bureaucrat to the people in the Pilipinas during that time. So limpak-limpak na salapi ang nakukuha. So it is a type of corruption, kumbaga. Okay? Yan. Now, what will happen if the proprietary bureaucrat die? Pag namatay siya, anong mangyayari sa position, sa office na kanyang pinagsisilbihan? Okay? When a proprietary bureaucrat died, the office will be reverted or returned to the king. Okay? Babalik sa harian. Yan. And there was a royal decree of 1616 which was promulgated specially for the Filipinas, and that decree ordered that positions be vacated by the death of the proprietary holder. And if that position is falling under the category of saleable offices, then that position can be sold. Okay? Or that position is to be sold again to the one who can buy or have the qualifications of buying the position. Grabe, no? Ganyan pala ang sistema during the time of the Spaniards. Nabibili ang posisyon sa bureaucracy. Eh ngayon kaya, mabibili kaya ang posisyon? What do you think? During the first years of Spanish colonization, there are two methods or ways for the aspiring bureaucrat to acquire employment in the bureaucracy. Okay? First, through the ordinary method of appointment. And the second one is kung kaya mong bilhin yung office through the purchase of office. Okay? Now, if the method is through the ordinary way of being appointed, the way to service through appointment then began with a petition for the royal favor. And if the applicant was in Filipinas, he must have to present his petition before the Royal Audiencia or the Supreme Court during that time in Manila. Okay? And then, if the Royal Audiencia decided that the applicant was an able person, it will conduct a secret investigation of the life of that applicant and generally of the qualifications and previous services of that applicant. Okay? And after the investigation, the Royal Audiencia will deliberate on the results. And when they arrive at a recommendation as to the favor or merced which he deserved, then this will be forwarded to the Consejo de los Indias, okay, in Spain. So after then, the Royal Audiencia had deliberated on the result of the applicant, okay, or the application of the applicants, they will come up with a recommendation, and that recommendation will be sent to the Consejo de los Indias in Spain. Imagine kung gaano kalayo yan, no? During that time. And during the first year of Spanish colonization, hindi pa open yung tinatawag nating Suez Canal. Okay? At sinasabi dito, the expedition during that time, during the first years of Spanish colonization in the Philippines, it takes at least 2 years to travel from Spain to the Philippines and from the Philippines to Spain. Okay? But going back to the application, if the Consejo de los Indias decided on what is deemed desirable and proper to the applicant, then the applicant will receive the position. Okay? If the applicant is in Spain, a similar investigation is also being undertaken for the applicant in Spain. Okay? Ayan. And the Royal, no, not the Royal Audiencia, the Consejo de los Indias will also look and come up with a recommendation, and then the Royal King will determine what royal favor will be given to that applicant. By the way, the King is part of the Consejo de los Indias. Now, that kind of procedure of sending the recommendations of the Royal Audiencia in the Philippines to the Consejo de los Indias in Spain was not rigorously followed after the years or after the first years of colonization in the Philippines. Why? Because if that time-consuming procedure had been followed, the inconvenience resulting from the great distance from Spain would have paralyzed the government. Okay? So it appears then that the requirement was meant only to furnish a record of the background of appointments made by appointing officers. Okay? Appointing officers who were present in the colonies during those times. And who were those appointing officers? We have the viceroys and the presidentes gobernadores. We can also call the presidentes gobernadores as governors general. Okay? And they were authorized to make ad interim appointments of gobernadores, corregidores, and alcalde mayores of provinces and principal towns. And the governor general was considered to be the highest official in the colony. And with him, the viceroys and members of the audiencias were appointed only by the king. And all other minor officials received their appointments from the highest official in the colony. And that is the Governor General. Okay? Now, in the Philippines, the most well-loved Governor General was Governor General Carlos Maria de la Torre, because he was a liberal Governor General with a liberal regime in the Philippines. Pero dapat alamin natin what happened during those times in 1869. Kaya't naka-receive tayo ng isang liberal na Governor General. What really happened in Spain? That's why we received a liberal government from a liberal Governor General. Okay? Now, the instructions to the appointing officers given by the Consejo de los Indias were quite general. And because of these general instructions, the appointing officers had been left much discretion. Napakalawak yung kanilang appointing power and also their power to govern the colony. Okay? Now, the appointees, the applicant who had been appointed in such position must be of good merits and services. And most of all, that appointee must be God-fearing and zealous. And actually, if the appointees are to commit crimes or excesses in their offices or encomiendas, they could be accused, tried, and punished freely and fully. Ganda ng idea, di ba? That when an appointee will go beyond his position, okay, using his power to commit crimes or excesses in his office, then that appointee could be what? Could be accused, tried, and punished. Pero nangyari ba yan during the time of colonization? Ha? Yan. Now, what will happen if there are several candidates in that position and those candidates had equal qualifications? Anong ginagawa ng appointing officer? Ang ginagawa ng Governor General is to make preference, okay, to the descendants of the discoverer. So for example, if I'm the discoverer of a province, then nawala na ako, but you are my descendant and you are an applicant of that said position, the Governor General will give preference to you. Okay? And then to pacifiers, to the settlers, and finally to those who were born in the Indias. But those who were born in the Indias are Spanish in blood. Okay? In appointing officers in the position of gobernadores, corregidores, and alcalde mayores, they must be Spaniards. Okay? Walang ibinigay na matataas na posisyon para sa mga Indios during that time. Let us talk about the purchase of office as a way of getting the position. Okay? The purchase of office, the bureaucrat who had acquired his office through purchase will have a title or deed. And in that title, there are statements in details. Okay? Ito yung mga yon. Kalagay dyan, the royal cedula authorizing the sale up to the bid and bidders for the office and qualifications and special conditions attached to the sale. Yan. However, the king enacted a large number of decrees instructing that offices were to be sold to the highest bidders. So if the way to get the position in the government is through the purchase, ang pipiliin ay yung highest bidder. Grabe. Diba? And not only that, only cash were to be accepted and not promises to pay. Ayan. But offices already held by a purchaser might be accepted in payment, and 1/3 of the value of such offices was to be assigned to the king. So may hati ang hari. Diba? Ayan. Even minors were qualified to buy offices during that time. But subject to the stipulation that the positions should be filled by their fathers or uncles upon payment of extra amount. Grabe pa lang, bilihan ng position during that time. Show money, kumbaga. Pera-pera lang yan. Yan. And then, saleable offices were not petty. Hindi lang basta-basta yung mga pwedeng bilhin na position during that time. Because saleable offices involve positions in the collection, assessment, and custody of public funds. Pera din ang pinag-uusapan dito. Okay? As well as collection of fees ordinarily charged for the performance of official acts. So, ibig sabihin that the purchase of office is not that petty. Hindi basta-basta din palang mga ipinagbibiling offices during that time. And because of that, the opportunities for making money from this post were therefore numerous. Okay? At nagkaroon dyan ng corruption. Because of the purchase of office, corruption also became rampant during that time. When some offices of government are occupied by persons who pay the highest price for them, such office holders naturally regard their purchases as private investments. Meaning to say, if the office was purchased by the one who really paid the highest price, then that person will treat the purchase office as a private investment. Grabe, di ba? Parang napakasama naman yung ganong klaseng bureaucrat in the government during those times. And in Pilipinas, the profit realized by such officials from the exploitation of their positions were understandably envied by those who were appointed or by those appointive colleagues they had. Why? Because after all, those appointive colleagues had come to the colony, underwent the normal method of appointment, and here they are, those who really can purchase the office, who are enjoying the profit of that office being purchased. Diba? Siyempre naman, sino ang hindi maiinggit sa ganon? But yan ang kalakaran during the Spanish colonization in the Philippines. And actually, the offices were also reserved to the members of a dominant race, okay? Transacting the affairs of the government, okay, and subjugating the helpless population, especially the native Filipinos during that time. And because of this practice, it led to other abuses. Okay? Yon. Actually, the most important offices which were often illicitly sold were the governorship of the provinces. Okay? And because of that, there were denunciations of the sales of offices during the 19th century. May action kaya na ginawa ang Consejo de los Indias or Indias sa pagkakataong ganyan kung saan nabibili ang position and they abuse the position to exploit the people in the colony. Let us see. Okay? If there were actions made by the Spain and the king in relation to this kind of abuses. So let us discuss the nature of Spanish bureaucracy. First, it is obvious that the Spanish bureaucracy in Philippines was a colonial bureaucracy. And being a colonial bureaucracy, the native subjects were then only allowed a negligible share in appointments to public offices and employments. So you can see here that even in the bureaucracy, discrimination was very rampant. In fact, the exclusion of natives was even more imperative in Spanish colonial administration. And if possible nga, ay hindi na mabigyan ng anumang posisyon ang mga natives during that time. Because traditionally, the Spaniards regarded offices in a colonial bureaucracy as positions legitimately and exclusively belonging to the colonies and not to the natives from the sovereign country. And moreover, they also viewed that the natives, the infidel, or only recently converted natives could not easily be accepted as the spiritual and moral equals of the Spaniard. And this was significant because in the Spanish system, political office was essentially also an office in the service of God. And the natives, according to the Spaniards, were therefore to be entrusted only with the most inconsequential offices. Grabe. Diba? Parang hindi natin kayang maglingkod para sa government at para sa tao during that time. And there was also the concept that all positions and offices in the colonies belonged to the monarchs, okay, and to the monarch regalia, and were granted as favors or mercedes to those who were deserving of them. And the Spaniards think during that time that we are not deserving to any position. Okay? And because of that foregoing conditions of office holding, for a long time, the indigenous native subjects were to stay in a position of administrative incapacity. Okay? Since this meant that positions in the main were to be exclusively assigned to the Spaniards. And the offices and positions of the lowest and not only the lowest position but also the incompetent position were given to the infidels or to the natives. Okay? And because of that, there was a wall of distinction, okay, between the natives and the dominant Spaniards. Okay? They were separate from each other not only by virtue of their belonging to different cultures and races, but also by virtue of their belonging to different classes based on office holding. Ayan. So, the contract between the Filipino and Spaniards through the Spanish bureaucracy then can hardly be described as harmonious. So, hindi harmonious ang relationship between the Filipinos and the Spaniards in the bureaucracy during that time. And under the actual conditions of government in Filipinas, the relationship provided number of occasions for oppressive abuse of the Spaniards in their governmental authority. And who suffered with these abuses of governmental authority? Diba? The natives, the Filipinos during that time. So, discrimination during the Spanish colonization did not only happen, okay, in racial discrimination, but also in holding office in the bureaucracy. Okay? The second characteristic of Spanish bureaucracy in the Philippines is the colonial community of which our newly arrived bureaucrat was now a member was considered to be a highly centralized organization. So, the centralization in this case was both physical and formal. Okay? The Spanish population was concentrated physically in the capital, Manila. Okay? Lalong-lalo na, or particularly, in the walled city of Intramuros. Yan. Now, the advantageous location of Manila and the events of the Legazpi expedition made it the colonial capital. And once the colonial occupation is secured and the colony prospers or its business increases, then the need for concentration is then reinforced by the need for easier administration of affairs. Okay? And after the capital city has become a political center, it inevitably becomes also the cultural and social center. Okay? And in Manila, since they made it as the capital of the colony, the Spanish community was composed of the priests and the friars, the bureaucrats and their relatives, the troops, yung mga nagbabantay, mga soldiers, okay, and guardia civils, and some and small numbers of private families who established their businesses, okay, in Manila as merchants, or some families that are waiting for government employment. So the concentration of the population of Spain was located in Manila. Kaya ito yung ginawa nilang capital of the colony. And until now, di ba? Still have Manila as the capital of our country. Now, what was the relationship between the bureaucrats during that time and the Spanish priests or the friars and the private citizens? Maganda kaya ang kanilang relationship during that time? How was the social interaction among the Spanish population in Manila during that time? Let us see. The relationships among the members of the small community of Spaniards in Manila were considered to be intensive and often in the form of conflicts. Even them, sila-sila ng mga Espanyol, ay nag-aaway-away din pala during those times. Okay? Because the clergy took upon themselves the duty of checking the official excesses and chastising the personal lapses of the bureaucrats. Yan yung mga naging papel ng mga friars during that time. Not only to spread the word, okay, but also to check on officials, especially those who are abusing their power in the bureaucracy. Okay? Yan. And on the other hand, the bureaucrats who were not proteges or who were not supporters of the ecclesiastics saw the activity of the clergy either an infringement of the royal jurisdiction or a dangerous threat to their own private interest. And in fact, some clerics were also guilty of indulging themselves in prohibited practices against the natives. Okay? Aside from discriminating the natives and treating them like slaves, the clergy or some clergy, sabihin natin some or most, di ba? Clergies were also involved in practices against the natives such as exacting unlawful contributions, okay, personal services, and exorbitant church fees. Yan. And the rest of the community of Spanish in Manila during that time became more or less involved in the conflicts, okay, sometimes because of blood relationship to the participants. At other times naman, because of personal favors owed or expected. So the conflict was worsened by the fact that the officers of the government and the prelates of the church were required to report to Spain concerning the conduct and daily life of all bureaucrats and private individuals. So nagkaroon ng siraan. And because of that, nobody's character or integrity was saved from the denigration or attack of those who sought employment or advancement in the bureaucracy. And this kind of practices in the bureaucracy during those times are still being manifested today. Not anymore between the clergy and the bureaucrat, but between the bureaucrat and other bureaucrats. Okay? Another characteristic of the Spanish bureaucracy in Filipinas was being a colonial bureaucracy. The Spanish regime in Filipinas was considered to be a subordinate government. And as a subordinate government, the regime was theoretically dependent in all things upon the home government. This was natural and to be expected from the colonial relationship. But the colonial relationships between Spain and Filipinas had ensured a situation which was the constant source of continuing administrative problems. Bakit kaya? Because on one hand, the distance of the colony, as you can see, okay, in my PowerPoint presentation, the distance here of Pilipinas to the distance of the home government made the bureaucracy in the Philippines a bureaucracy that had led to major problems. Okay? Because on the one hand, as I said a while back, the distance of the colony and the resultant difficulty of continuous supervision and oversight required that the subordinate government be organized and vested with such amplitude power as was necessary to permit autonomous administrative operations. Kasi matagal ang pagdating ng order. Okay? Galing sa Consejo de los Indias from Spain going to the Philippines. So, nagkaroon tuloy ng autonomous administrative operations ang mga officers natin sa Pilipinas, especially or particularly the Governor General, nang hindi na mahintay yung orders galing sa home government. Okay? So, to meet this necessity to have autonomous administrative operations, the home government had to give a vast grant of power to the chief officials in the colony. Yan. On the other hand, the same factors of the distance and difficulty of continuous control raised the ever-present possibility that the colony may secede or separate from the home government. And so, to avert that possibility, the broad authority given to the high colonial officials was offset by a number of measures. Okay? For the Spanish Empire as a whole, the supreme legislative and judicial powers were vested in the Consejo de las Indias. And the executive power, together with such supplementary legislative and judicial powers that are necessary to implement the Consejo's laws, was given in official residence in the colonies. And the colonial officials were theoretically bound to act strictly and only within the boundary of the laws and instructions of the Consejo. And the colonial government were always very strict in giving command that no innovation should be done. And this was known as no se haga novedad. So, the home government had this strict command that the colonial government must have not to innovate, okay, or there is no innovation that should be done. Okay? And the lack of practical and regular controls from the remote home government, together with the necessity to cope with extraordinary situations, had required frequent evasions to the command of no innovation. Given the fact that Spain is very remote from the Philippines. So this command that there must be no innovation to be done had been frequently evaded by the officials of the colony. But it remained in principle an underlying theory of the colonial administrative system. Meaning to say that if there is no command coming from the Consejo allowing to innovate some aspect of the bureaucracy in the colony, then there must be no innovation to be made. Okay? Because as we said, the supreme legislative and judicial powers were really vested in the Consejo de las Indias. Another characteristic of the Spanish bureaucracy is the colonial bureaucracy of Spain in Filipinas was fundamentally affected by Spanish colonial objectives. And what were those objectives of the Spanish colonization? It is stated that the Supremo Consejo de las Indias, which represents the royal person, was charged to regard the conversion and religious instructions of the native as its principal concern. Likewise, the viceroys and governors of the Indias were also instructed to hold the service of God and the extension of his sacred law as their first and principal concern. But inasmuch as there is a wide range of colonial objectives, our focus here in our discussion of the Spanish bureaucracy are those objectives which relate to the Spanish bureaucracy in Pilipinas. Okay? Yan. Because most of the kings during the Spanish colonization really desired nothing more than to spread the evangelical law and the conversion of the Indios. But there were other monarchs who commanded also the viceroys and superior officials to aid, protect, and defend the Indios from whatever injuries. Ganda din, no? So meaning to say, there were also monarchs who really wanted not only to evangelize and spread the word, but also to protect the colonies, particularly the people in the colony. And if there were, let us say, abuses, or discriminations, or violations of the people in the colony, there were monarchs who were also pushed, okay, to punishing the oppressors with special rigorous public demonstration. Okay? But the problem is the above colonial objectives were not spelled out according to a definite scheme of priority or importance. And the colonial bureaucrats were unsympathetic. They were not sympathetic with the objective of the colonial regime, and because they were not accountable to the subjects whose lives they administered, then abuse were made. Okay? Bureaucratic misdeed often frustrated the aims of the regime and sacrificed the welfare of the subjects. So, ang ganda ng objectives. And actually, there were many objectives, there were wide objectives of the monarch or the home government to the colonies, but they were not realized because many of the officials in the colonies were also the abusers of the people. Okay? So, the colonial bureaucracy then of Spain in Filipinas was also fundamentally affected by the Spanish colonial objectives. Although, okay, these objectives were not realized. Most of the objectives, okay, were not spelled out accordingly to what the monarch wanted it to be. And because of these abuses made by the Spaniards, the people or the Indios learned to fight back. For a long period of time being oppressed, for a long period of time being subjugated and treated like slaves and racially discriminated by the Spaniards, the Filipinos learned to fight back, particularly the intellectuals who really wanted freedom from the oppressors. And because of that, the Spanish colonization for a long period of time, for almost 300 years, okay, it ended because the people learned how to fight back. And what happened? Dumating ang Amerika. Okay? And during the American regime, at least, the Filipinos were given the opportunity to participate in the government, not only in the lowest position of the bureaucracy, but also the highest position in the government. Okay? And so, let us talk about the Philippine civil service during the American regime in the year 1935 up to 1955. In here, we will look into the works of Onofre Corpuz in describing the bureaucracy and the civil service in the Philippines between 1935 and 1955. Okay? So, what is all about the civil service during that period? The civil service during this period had passed through brief but basic evolutionary process and phases. And constitutionally, the country was under 3 different governments. And you know that. Okay? Yan. And the 1935 Philippine Commonwealth Government vested the executive power to a Filipino president, thus completing the gradual transfer of governmental functions to Filipinos. And the remaining American authority in the Philippines was vested in an American High Commissioner representing the President of the United States of America. Yan. And this High Commissioner representing the President of US had no direct administrative powers. He was only concerned generally with the protection of American interests and the fulfillment of the Commonwealth government's contractual obligations. Okay? And for your information, the Philippine Commonwealth was inaugurated on November 15, 1935. And that kind of government was considered to be Republican in form. Okay? Not only Republican in form, but Filipino in personnel. And it enjoyed autonomy in domestic affairs. So napakaganda. During the time of the Americans, particularly between 1935 and 1955, the Filipinos were really given total participation in all governmental activities, from the highest position up to the lowest position, and they also enjoyed autonomy in domestic affairs. And so, let us discuss the phases of development in the civil service during the time of the American regime. Okay? The Philippine Civil Service, or the administrative apparatus, which was inherited by the Philippine Commonwealth from the government that preceded it, meaning the Americans, okay, was not yet true Filipino institution. After the inauguration of the Commonwealth government, okay, bureaucracy, particularly its personnel and direction, had been Filipinized. But it was a borrowed and not a spontaneously native institution. Okay? And what were the manifestations that the government that the Filipinos are enjoying during that time were not yet was not yet true Filipino institution? Because the basic spirit, the organizational structure, and rules were of American inspiration pa lang. Okay? And the Filipinos share in the development of bureaucracy, whether progressive or retrogressive, was subject to confirmation or rejection by a higher American authority. And so, if the Philippine Commonwealth government, particularly the civil service, was not yet truly Filipino in its nature, there was therefore only one way in which a genuine application of native genius to the civil service was possible. And that is fixing the date for the independence and by granting domestic autonomy to the Philippine Commonwealth government. And even if the service were preserved in the condition that it was inherited, its principles may still remain American, but substantial changes would be possible, and in any case, the decision would be Filipino. Okay? And the first decision to really push the fixing of the date for independence and by granting domestic autonomy to the Philippine Commonwealth government was taken in a constitutional convention. And the Committee on Civil Service of that body successfully emphasized the necessity for constitutional provisions on the civil service. And in that constitutional convention, it expressed a point that the Constitution must include provisions regarding merit system as a necessity in the bureaucracy. And in that provision, it states that appointments in the civil service, except as to those which are policy determining, primarily confidential or highly technical in nature, shall be made only according to merit and fitness. And that to be determined as far as practicable by competitive examination. So that was the first move. Okay? To really have a Philippinized bureaucracy during the American regime, there must be the fixing of the date for the independence and by granting domestic autonomy to the Philippine Commonwealth government. But the question is, naging successful ba yung transition? So we will know later as we go on with the lesson. Okay? The inclusion of the merit system also guaranteed employment in the service as a career by prohibiting removals or suspensions except for cause as provided by law, and by proscribing the consideration of political or religious opinions or affiliations in appointments, promotions, and in disciplinary proceedings against civil service personnel. The provisions was really intended or were really intended for a civil service as a truly Filipino civil service. But the outbreak of the war in the Pacific in 1941 had interrupted these well-laid plans of the Commonwealth and disrupted also the gradual process by which the bureaucracy had been developing. And that war, which was expected by most Filipinos to last only a few months, had dragged them through the rest of 1942 until 1944. And in fact, the Commonwealth government itself ceased to be operative early in 1942. And the active government during the war years was the Japanese military administration, which attempted to secure Filipino cooperation by setting up the facade of a Filipino civil administration, okay, and the establishment of a republic in 1943. And that establishment of the Philippine Republic in 1943 was the major step in the Japanese efforts to estrange the Filipino relationship and loyalty from the cause of the Americans. And as I said, that the active government during the war years was the Japanese military administration. Okay? And in that setting up of a Filipino civil administration, it ordered the establishment of a Philippine Executive Commission in January 1942. Okay? And followed by setting up a Philippine Republic in 1943. And these were major steps, okay, that the Japanese effort to estrange our loyalty and our relationship from the cause of the Americans and the US. Okay? Yan. During the Japanese occupation, the dislocation and demoralization of the civil service were considered to be unavoidable results of two factors. First is the motive of patriotic sabotage of the occupation administration. This means that after the defeat of Filipino-American forces in the mid-1942, many of the administrative and clerical rank and file employees of the civil service returned to their old positions. And sympathetic collaboration with the Japanese occupation regime became the dominant qualification for the higher positions and for the advancement within the service. And adding to this is a coerced collaboration by which important civil servants were drafted for service on pain or reprisals against themselves or their families. And the second factor that led to the dislocation and demoralization of the civil service was the worthless paper money with which the Japanese military administration watered public finance. Because during that time, the Japanese regime printed countless millions of fiat paper money to pay for provisions and employee salaries. And the result of this was really devastating, not only to the bureaucracy, but also to the economy of the Philippines during that time. Because the worthless paper money, okay, was considered to be, in a short time, the countless millions of printed fiat money had led to the disruption of production, okay, the scarcity of goods and services, and the overabundance of the war notes, which depressed the real value of the salaries and wages almost to nothing. Okay? And under these conditions, the overwhelming mass of civil servants were forced to realize that because of the useless money, acceptance of bribe for performance or non-performance of official duties became rampant. Okay? And other corrupt practices were frequently to augment their salary incomes up to a level of adequate value to support their families. So the service, in short, was demoralized by patriotism and runaway inflation during the Japanese occupation. And when the Commonwealth government was re-established in 1945 and the civil administration was remobilized, the task or duty of reviving the prostrate national economy seemed impossible. As you can see here in the picture, we can three personalities that became president of the Philippines. Okay, we have here Osmeña, and then Manuel Rojas, and Elpidio Quirino. Okay, they were the presidents during the post-war period. Okay, but as I told you a while back, the duty of reviving, okay, the depressed national economy seemed impossible. And the bureaucracy of the immediate post-war period was characterized mainly by low prestige, incompetence, meager income, and large measure of cynical corruption. Yan. And the low prestige was caused primarily by substandard salaries and corrupt bureaucratic behavior. Yan. But the situation was somewhat alleviated in 1947 when minimum wage or the law for minimum wage was enacted, boosting the minimum government salary. So this new pay, however, were not more than a stopgap measures. Meaning to say it cannot really augment the needs of the people during that time, especially those who are working in the bureaucracy, because they were inadequate. They were adjusted only for cost of living that were computed for minimum or subsistence standard of living. And the salary rates of civil servants in the important technical and professional positions were unaffected by that minimum wage law. Okay? That resulted or that led to the resignation of expert civil servants. And because of that, in consequence, there was no pool of candidates with desirable moral and ethical and technical qualifications from which to draw replacement for deceased or retired bureaucrats. Okay? And added to the worst scenario of the bureaucracy during that time was the carryover of attitudes and habits of the wartime years, which were manifested in that bureaucracy. Okay? When even upright bureaucrats were demoralized by almost daily practices in administrative corruption. Yan. And so, the dominant nationalista party in Philippine party politics became the party that served an important factor in safeguarding the civil service from the spoils of bureaucratic corruption. The spoils here are the practices of corruption that happened during the post-war period in the Philippines. Okay? Not only to the Nationalista Party, not only served as a factor from safeguarding the civil service from the spoils of bureaucratic corruption, but also the direct authority of the American chief executive. Okay? And there is what we call uncontested position of the political party, the Nationalista Party during that time. Okay? Ayan. But, shortly, before the first post-war elections, that was April 1946, the old party was split in a fight for leadership. And a new era in Philippine politics began. Because there were then two parties. One wing of the old party, which is the Nationalista Party, and the other newly organized party as Liberal Party. And with that creation of a new party, a new evolutionary phase for the Philippine civil service also started. Because for the first time in history, the bureaucracy was vulnerable already to party politics. And the birth of the two-party system meant the rise of partisan interest already. Because opposing party interest gave rise to party motives. So hindi pala naging maganda ang dulot. The effect of having a two-party system during the post-war period Philippines greatly affected the bureaucracy. Okay? And greatly affected the government. Because in the creation of a two-party system, it led also to partisan interest. Yan. The triumph of the Liberal Party in 1946 at a time of widespread opportunism was immediately followed by a distribution of the spoils, which consisted of vacant and new classified service positions. Meaning to say, when the Liberal Party gained power in the national government, spoil system occurred, giving positions to those who are really supporting the Liberal Party during that time. Karoon ng nepotism, compadre system, okay? Political interest is being put at the pedestal rather than the interest of the people. Okay? But it should be noted that the particular kind of spoil system here that arose during that time did not include the indiscriminate removal of bureaucrats in the classified service. Because the security of tenure of classified employees was respected by politicians as a general rule and was invariably upheld by the courts of law. So, fortunately, the spoil system did not affect the bureaucracy under the merit, fitness, and the security of tenure system. Okay? Because politicians respected that general rule. And that the courts also upheld the security of tenure. But those years of the Liberal Party, actually ganito kasi ang nangyari. After the death of Quezon, ni-replace siya ni Sergio Osmeña. Actually, Quezon and Osmeña were members of the same party, the Nacionalista Party. But during the post-war period, 1945, okay, nahati yung Nacionalista into two factions. Okay? At naging Liberal Party yung newly organized political party led by Manuel Rojas. Okay? Manuel Rojas won the election against Osmeña. But shortly after 2 years, namatay si Manuel Rojas because of a heart attack. And he was succeeded by his Vice President, Elpidio Quirino, who was also a die-hard liberal political member. Okay? Ayan. And during the years of Elpidio Quirino, his term and his government were characterized by insolence, ineptitude, and corruption of clerks on the other hand, and by appointment and promotion for political reasons on the other hand. Ito na yung tinatawag nating spoil system. Okay? So, the sins and weaknesses of the bureaucracy during the liberal regime, which lasted from 1946 to 1953, medyo mahaba din, okay, were fully reported by the press. Okay? Ayan. So, this Liberal Party regime during the post-war period had been characterized as a regime where corruption and the spoil system were very rampant. Okay? Now, there were two events that took place in 1949 that raised the matter of reform in the bureaucracy to the forefront of public concern. First was the Hook Rebellion. Okay? The Hook Rebellion was a communist-led agrarian uprising, okay, that had prospered since after the end of the war. Because the masses of the population either were too occupied in the difficult and slow process of rehabilitation or had lost their faith in the government and felt that the Hooks had legitimate grievances. Okay? But the Hooks overestimated their strengths and their hold in public sympathy because they allowed or perpetrated atrocities on defenseless civilians and by open defiance of constitutional order, to the point that they are killing people if they are not sympathetic to the Hook during that time. Okay? Another event that took place in 1949 that really brought or shaken the bureaucracy for reform was the national elections. Yan. The national elections here, the opposition party, the Nacionalista, campaigned on the issue of graft and corruption in the government. Unfortunately, it lost, but not without widespread and unalloyed suspicion of election frauds by the liberals. Yan. So there was an election happened in 1949, okay, between the Nacionalista Party and the Liberal Party. Unfortunately, as I said a while back, the members of the Nacionalista Party who ran the election, during the election, lost. Okay? But the elections during that time were considered to be an election of fraud by the liberals. So those traumatic events that happened in 1949 produced, organized, and insistent public demands for clean government, which the administration could not afford to ignore. So, in 1950, the Philippine government requested the U.S. government to send a mission to survey Philippine conditions as they affected economic development and financial stability. The mission came promptly and concerned itself with, among others, the state of public administration in the Philippines. It reported on matters as follows: that the present system, although designed to be based on merit, does not function in this way. And the mission made a number of suggestions covering the whole field of civil service operations and management, including such proposals for improved recruitment, examination, training, efficiency procedure, okay, and continuing public research. Yan. But those years were still considered to be the years of the Liberal Party regime. Attached to it is the years of corruption and malpractices also. Yan. At sirang-sira noon si Elpidio Quirino. Okay? Actually, there was an issue about Elpidio Quirino and his golden Arinola. The golden Arinola scandal. Do you know that? Have you ever heard the so-called golden Arinola or chamber pot, okay, of former President Elpidio Quirino? According to the rumor, okay, rumor lang naman, Quirino had a golden Arinola and a brand new bed worth 5,000 pesos during that time. Okay? And that money is considered to be a lot of money that should be spent for the people. Because during that time, that $5,000, no pesos, sorry, can be used to uneconomically distressed people. Okay? So this golden Arinola of Quirino was considered to be, or it symbolized, a corrupt and uncaring government. It did not help that, unlike the down-to-earth and affable Ramon Magsaysay, okay, could not help Quirino, okay, win the people's affection. Yan. And so, the identification of the Liberal Party with corrupt government practices did not make it the best agency for implementing the suggested reforms made by the American mission. Okay? And in the by-elections of 1951, the Nacionalistas again campaigned on the same issues as in 1949. Okay? The liberals lost all the seats at stake These were the 8 seats in the Philippine Senate, comprising 1/3 elected every after 2 years of the total membership of 24. This was made possible because by the time, the people, through civic organizations in all towns and cities, had watched over the elections closely. To the point that communication systems were organized to announce precinct results immediately, and voters were also given protection against possible intimidation and coercion. Okay? And the actual ballot counting was vigilantly supervised. Okay? Yan. And the process was again repeated in the presidential and general elections of 1953 between Elpidio Quirino and Ramon Magsaysay. Actually, the 1953 elections was considered to be the greatest turnout in the country's history, okay, that people went to the polls. Most of the people went to the polls. Okay? The campaign was tense, but the elections were peaceful. The liberals were ousted from control in the national, provincial, and municipal levels of government. And the Nacionalista Party came back to power. And then, the accomplishment of the new administration under Magsaysay by 1955 were satisfactory. Many of the recommendations of the survey were being implemented. Support and aid from the executive and the legislative officials of the new administration and cooperation from the employees of the civil service with some technical assistance from the US were yielding fruit. Okay? And among the worthiest projects in the program of rehabilitating the Philippine civil service was the establishment of an Institute of Public Administration in UP in the 1950s. Okay? And in 1955, okay, you can see here that gradually the government or much of the ground that had been lost was being recovered by the government. And the most important definite gain by 1955 was the substantial restoration of morality in public service. And much of the initiative in the recovery was clearly due to the concern of President Magsaysay about the administrative apparatus with which he was going to solve the problems bequeathed to him by the liberal administration. But, sabi nga natin, the most important definite gain in 1955 was the substantial restoration of morality in public service. Actually, during the term of Magsaysay, the Malacanang Palace was open to the people. At meron ang sabi-sabi na nung pinayagan ng mga tao to enter the palace, they were looking for the golden Arinola of Elpidio Quirino. Okay? Certainly, the Philippine bureaucracy that time was characterized by both positive and negative descriptions. What mattered most was the bureaucracy was able to rise again and do what is necessary to be done. That is, genuine and honest public service to the people. So given the ideas and learning you acquired from the lesson, you deserve a treat. Okay? So good luck and God bless. See you next week. Enjoy learning.